start and people will join. Hello, everyone. I'm Shonal Agarwal, Director of Chapters, and I am so privileged to be having this workshop to launch Carl Anderson's new book, Teaching About Fantasy. Now, tell me, I hope I haven't got it wrong, Carl, please. Sorry.
You're good. You're good.
Okay. So, yeah, I was just going to put up my screen and I did. Right. So, this book, a little bit of a story behind a few years, I think it was 21 or 22, Carl and myself were walking around Central Park in New York, and he was telling me about how this was something he was thinking of writing, and he was writing another book with Matt, and he's going to go in and start it. And before we know it, it's already launched, and we are here talking, and everybody's reading this. So that's just a bit of a background and story behind that book. It's a great book. I have just read a little bit, but I'm not going to say much. We have Matt Glover here, who will be talking with Carl about the book as well. So here's to Carl Anderson. Congratulations. And we'll have Matt ask Carl a few questions about his journey.
Well, thank you so much, Shonal, and to Chapters International for hosting this. And Matt, thank you for being here this morning. And thanks to everybody that's either live on this webinar. Hello, good to see you as we celebrate fantasy writing. And I know a lot of people will be watching this later. So hello to you. So let me do, first, let's just do formal introductions. And then we'll get started with our program that Matt's going to be emceeing. So, yeah, so Shonal, there's actually the official title, Teaching Fantasy Writing Lessons That Inspire Student Engagement and Creativity. And just the cast of characters tonight. Hi, I'm Carl Anderson. I've been in education for, gosh, almost 40 years, I think, and started as an elementary and middle school teacher, and I've been a teacher educator for about 30 years and written a whole bunch of books on teaching writing. Myself, recent books have included a Teacher's Guide to Mentor Text and a Teacher's Guide to Writing Conferences. I'm joined by my dear friend and colleague, Matt Glover, and you can see some of his many books that he's written up there, including his brilliant craft and process studies and engaging young writers, projecting possibilities for writers, and I Am Reading. And then, as Shonal said, Matt and I published a book together about a year ago, 10 months ago, called How to Become a Better Writing Teacher, which we worked on for several years during the pandemic and afterwards. And then we're here to celebrate this new book here tonight, Teaching Fantasy Writing, which actually I wrote at the same time that Matt and I were writing our book, and they're actually very parallel projects. And the work that Matt and I did together in writing our book was so instrumental in the writing of Teaching Fantasy Writing. So anyway, that's the cast of characters for tonight. The format of this is Matt's going to be leading the conversation with a series of questions about teaching fantasy writing. So Matt, hi. Haven't seen you in a while. Let's see, we worked together the last 3 days in Maine. We both flew home last night, and here we are at 5 o'clock in the morning. And you got home at midnight, and I think I went to bed around 11. So here we are. Can't hear you. Can't hear you.
Sorry, Carl. No,
okay.
I'm so glad to be here and get to talk about this, just because I feel so strongly about this book. Carl and I have talked about this book for a long time, and I just think it's a really important book, especially given the educational environment that we live in, where increasingly you see students in situations where there's certain things that make them less engaged writers, and it's often that they're writing in the same genres over and over, or that they year after year, or that they are never have choice of genre or topic, or they're not writing authentic things. And what's so nice about this book is Carl's supporting students. It's really a book about engagement. Certainly it's focused on fantasy writing, but so many of the ideas and the things in this book really are focused around the crucial role of engagement in student writing. It's just very difficult to become a better writer if you're not writing a lot, and it's difficult to write a lot if you're not an engaged writer. And so it's not just thinking about the impact that fantasy has on engagement, but also the role of having students writing authentic things, right? Having authentic mentor text, having teachers that are conferring with them, supporting their engagement in that way. And so it's not just a book around fantasy, but really a book around becoming helping students become more engaged writers through the actions we take as teachers. So just thrilled to be here and to get to talk about this, book.
Yeah, and Matt, I just wanted to piggyback on that idea of just engagement and the importance of including really engaging units of study into our writing curriculums. I'm in the middle of reading several books right now, but one of the books that I'm reading is Elizabeth Rundell's Impossible Creatures, which I'm not sure if you can really see right now, but it's a brand new book out of England and brilliant fantasy book. And it's fun to read it because I'm reading it as a writer, as I read it as a reader. And it's so interesting how some of the things Elizabeth does in writing the book, like early in the book, the main character, one of the main characters, Christopher, is visiting his grandpa in Scotland, and his grandpa says, "Don't go on top of the mountain." So you all know that kids being kids, they're going to definitely go to the top of the mountain. So, it's interesting how this book is definitely written with the needs, with the tastes of children in mind. Children reading this book very, very curiously will, yes, let's go to the top of the mountain. It's so kid friendly. Of course, kids love this book. And, I don't think we think enough about curriculum and the needs of children. And what's really going to excite children about writing. And so, fantasy is a genre that when we ask kids, you and I ask kids what they want to write, it's if it's not the number one genre that kids want to write, certainly the second or third. It's very popular. Yet rarely do kids get a chance to write fantasy in school because so often writing curriculum is not really written with the needs of children, with the interests of children in mind. And so I hope this book makes a contribution towards that.
No, I agree with you, Carl, because I ask children all the time. I care a lot about issues around choice and issues around choice of genre. And so I'm frequently asking children, I've asked thousands of children now, what's your favorite genre to write in, especially in the upper grades? What's your favorite genre to write? And the most common one, the one that they'll say most often is fantasy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not every child, there's a range of them, but it's not number one or two in my experience, which is that it's number one in the upper grades and it's right there in the younger grades as well. And so and at the same time, I spend a lot of time looking at schools' units of study across grades. I spend a lot of time looking at the schools' units. The most underrepresented genre study in the upper grades is fantasy. Direct mismatch often between what students are dying to write and what students are actually studying in school. So I agree completely. All right, so let's think about a few things about fantasy, Carl. And I guess I'm gonna first thing I'm curious about is just why do you think that is? What we were just talking about. Why do you think fantasy is so engaging for students? Why is it the most popular one that students will say when they have or the ones that they'll choose when they have choice of genre? What is it about fantasy that makes it so appealing to children?
Well, I think parallel to wanting to write fantasy, kids love to read fantasy. And so much of what they read in, when they're even before they go to school, when they're in elementary, when they're in middle school, is some form of fantasy writing. And of course, they want to write it. And I think one thing that's really interesting to think about with fantasy writing, and this is something that doing the research for this book in classrooms over the last several years is something that has come through again and again, that fantasy gives kids expressive possibilities that a lot of genres don't really offer children. I think a lot of you here probably love fantasy yourself and understand that fantasy is a lot more than witches and wizards and trolls and elves and dragons. The people write fantasy because they have a lot of important things to work out and explore. We know adult writers, adult fantasy writers, are often writing about themselves through fantasy. I mean, J.K. Rowling in Harry Potter, she has said that the three children are aspects of herself, and that she very specifically knows that parts of those books were reflective of the life she was leading at the time. The death of her mother is reflected in the death of Harry Potter's parents. J.R. Tolkien is channeling his experience in World War I. People have said that Frodo exhibits classic symptoms of PTSD. And if you know Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time series, one of the greatest modern classics of fantasy, Robert Jordan was fought in the Vietnam War in the U.S. Army, and that experience comes through the battle scenes in the Wheel of Time, and he wrote about that before he died. So I think people use fantasy for that reason. And Matt, I want to share one piece that I think really shows how kids use fantasy to to think about really important issues in their own lives. So let's see. And I know you've seen this piece, Matt. So let me just put up Sanaa's piece. Or is that? Sorry, I have several slide decks that I'm trying to navigate here, and this is not the right one. Sorry, everybody. Let me put the correct one up. Here we go. All right. So I'm gonna share the writing of a third grader from Brooklyn. Sanaa, let me just read it. It's Sanaa's piece called Ellie's Unicorn. And and you might think reading this, okay, this is gonna be a unicorn story and whatever. But I think you'll see that what Sanaa is exploring in this piece are really profound issues. And as you'll see, that are very, very germane to her life at the time. So here is Sanaa's piece. Let me see if I can get rid of that little message about this. Sorry, I'm having a little trouble. There's a message that's blocking stuff. Okay, so here we go. All right, so here's Ellie's unicorn. Ellie's 10 years old with one parent. Her mom passed away when she was 8. She misses her a lot. They used to play and sing together. At school, people talk about their moms and how they let them use knives and microwaves. Ellie starts to feel jealous, and one day she just can't take it, so she took a day off of school to relax. To calm down, she goes in the snow with her dad. While she was playing in the snow with her dad, Ellie slips on a hard piece of ice into a portal. Ow, Ellie screamed. She looked up. Where am I? Am I dead? She touched the ground to see if she was dead. Okay, not dead. Ellie kept walking. She heard her dad yell, Ellie, but she couldn't see or reach him. After a while of exploring, she ran into a cottage with the unicorn horn on top. She tiptoed up to the door and knocked. Hello, Ellie whispers. A unicorn pops out. Hello, the unicorn said. Whoa, a human. Come in. Okay. Ellie walks in and sits on the couch. My name is Luna. Mine is Ellie. Ellie smiled. Mom loves unicorns. Want to play? I confess, Luna asks. Sure, I go first. Do you have powers? Yep, I can bring people who passed alive for 24 days. Really? Ellie started crying. Ellie told Luna about her mom and how she passed away. Luna thinks, we just met. Should I really do it? Ellie was confused. Aren't you going to summon her? Maybe later, but let's play now. Ellie stood there speechless. Later, that's it? Ellie scolded Luna. Later, really? Are you serious? I thought you would help me. Ellie storms off and slams the door. Ellie thinks, what a traitor. I thought she would help me. Luna starts to feel bad and wants to help Ellie. Luna opens the door. Come back. Ellie rolls her eyes. Fine. Boom. Ellie's mom was back. The second Ellie's mom was back, they hugged very tight. I miss you, Ellie mumbled in her mom's chest. I missed you too, her mom said. Thanks, Luna, for bringing her back. You're welcome. Remember, she's only here for 24 days. All right. Ellie and her mom walked out of the house. They jumped in the portal and Dad is waiting. They all reunite and hug. Dad even starts to cry because he is so happy. Ellie starts to feel so much joy that she cries too. They stop hugging until Luna walks up to them. I forgot you guys can't get home. Luna magically makes a car and hands the keys to Dad, and they drive off. While in the car, Ellie looks back and feels happy because she knows when to say goodbye. And here's about the author. I'm 8 years old. I wrote this fantasy story for my cousin because she lost her mom. I'll always love you, Zoe, Sanaa. And so, so here's, so you might think on some superficial level that fantasy is just kind of, unicorns and wizards, blah, 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 and you have fun doing it. But here's a child that is grappling with something profoundly, a huge life event, a relative who's passed away that has certainly affected her family. Her cousin is devastated by the loss of her mom. And, how do 8-year-olds, this is an 8-year-old child, how do 8-year-olds make sense of these kinds of things? How do they work through these kinds of issues? And fantasy just gives kids tools to express themselves, to work through things. And here's this story. Where, I think the underlying realization that Sanaa is working through is that, that someone may have passed, but you can bring them back in your mind, and say goodbye to them. But there's a time limit to that. At some point in your life, you're going to have to let go. And say goodbye to the person who has passed. But you can do that. And I think metaphorically, that's what the story is all about. Do I think Sanaa is conscious of doing a lot of this? No, she's 8 years old. I think that, fantasy gives kids tools to do a lot of world play, do a lot of, emotional and intellectual play, and to work on these issues. And I know, Matt, I've shared with you a lot of other stories like this, where kids, invariably, when I'm working with a child in a school who's working on fantasy writing, there's some connection to their life that's important. One of the common stories I get in elementary school, I've seen several boys doing this. They have a main character who's not very good at a sport. And they meet a magical creature who, in a way, acts as their coach, gives them the confidence to play soccer or play another sport. And then at the end of the story, the child is now able to play the sport better. And, sometimes I confer with some of these kids, and, you can tell this is a kid that probably struggles in sports and really wants to be good at it. And through fantasy, they're able to kind of create a scenario in which, well, how can I get better at this? I can get coached. I can actually be successful at this. And so that's the story I've seen in many, many classrooms that children choose to write. And so they're working on issues of, how can I become successful at something through fantasy? So again and again and again, I think and Matt, to go back to your question, what's so engaging about fantasy? It's just, as I'm going to see if I can find a slide here. By Brandon Sanderson. Sorry, we're going to go through where the wild things are backwards very quickly. Let's see if I can find this. Here we are. This is what Brandon Sanderson, one of the great fantasy writers in the world right now, the author of many series, including the ongoing Stormlight Archive. But he says that fantasy is the biggest genre of all, meaning that it isn't bound by the conventions of other narrative genres. Freed from these conventions, fantasy offers children a set of exciting and versatile tools for expressing themselves. And so I think that really engagement in fantasy, Matt, is all about what the genre allows kids to express and work through and think about. It's utterly fascinating for me in schools to see these stories unfold, and when I know the connection to a child's life, to see that. And also, Matt, it's just fun to write fantasy too. I don't think we have enough fun and joy in schools, and it's a lot of fun to play with this stuff and play with magic and magical creatures and worlds that you create.
Well, and it just makes me think about the generative nature of writing. I think one of the reasons we both care so much about students as writers is the power from a creativity standpoint of going from nothing to something over an extended period of time. And in this case, the things that they're building, right, in terms of creating characters and creating worlds and creating problems and solutions, very different than other types of writing, and they're very different than, for example, personal narrative writing. And so I'm wondering what you're thinking about in terms of just how fantasy impacts and supports students from a creativity standpoint.
One thing I should say up front, Matt, and this was part of the research in doing this book, was reading research about children's creativity. And one of the things that we have, that assessments of children's creativity over the last several decades has shown a marked drop in children's creative skills, going back to the 1980s. And there's even been cover stories in magazines, popular magazines like Newsweek in the United States, about what is called the creativity crisis. And and The culprits I don't think are that surprising. There's a lot less play in schools. The pressures of standardized testing here in the States have put a kibosh on a lot of really creative work. And so, not surprisingly, children here in the States, at least, are less creative. And you and I are in schools all the time here, where we're just seeing more and more children not having a lot of opportunity to be creative in school and learning creative schools. And what does fantasy offer? I mean, fantasy is not going to solve the creativity crisis, but it is a kind of writing that really builds children's creative skills. And that's because one real key part of fantasy writing, and those of you that read fantasy and are interested in the genre and how it's written know this, but a key part of fantasy writing is what we call world building. Okay, and that's where before you write a fantasy story, you imagine the world that the story is going to take place. And when you read the thinking and the thoughts of fantasy writers about their craft, they all talk about this. They all talk about the fun they have in creating worlds. And when you look at fantasy novels, there's evidence of this in the even before the story starts. I mean, before you read The Phantom Tollbooth, you see this map of the world that Norton Juster created. Okay, you see that here in Lev Grossman's The Magicians, great fantasy series for adults. And then here's the map that's the beginning of The Wheel of Time, Robert Jordan series. So fantasy writer after fantasy writer, just they build worlds. And when we teach fantasy writing to children, part of what we teach kids is how to do some world building. Which is sometimes called world play. And there is a psychological term that describes this. Separate from fantasy writing, one thing that's really, I mean, a lot of you know that young children have imaginary friends. I think 2/3 of children that are, I think, younger than 5 have some kind of imaginary friend. And 1 out of 4 children, as they get a little bit older, create what's called a paracosm, or an imaginary world that they come up with and interact with. And very famous people have done this. Some of you know the Bronte sisters, very famous for that. Mozart created paracosms. C.S. Lewis had a paracosm as a child. And when children have paracosms, the research has shown that when children have their own imaginary worlds they create, it's linked to to both creative and scientific achievement later in life. So it's not just a superfluous thing they do. I think 25% of MacArthur Genius Award winners had paracosms as children. And so when you teach fantasy writing, you're actually teaching a skill that highly creative people do, that figure out themselves as children. But when we do fantasy writing, all children get a chance to do some of this highly creative work. And it's just so much fun to do this. When I work with upper grade children, one of the first moves in a fantasy unit is to teach kids how to create these worlds. So this is a world created by Alyssa Pang. She is a student of mine from Shenzhen, China, who I worked with during the pandemic and did a fantasy study with a group of children with her, and that really led to this book. I worked with Alyssa then for a couple of years on helping her turn her fantasy story into a novel. She's a middle school student now, but this is the world of Budgielin that she created, which is populated by all sorts of budgie creatures. And that comes from her life, by the way. She has a pet budgie, and so she created all these different budgie creatures that populated this world that she told this story about. Here's some other worlds that children have created. This is Amin. He's I think was rising 7th grader when he did this. This was an island world that he created, a kind of just like in a way what Ursula Le Guin did in her Earthsea series. And there's a series of islands here populated by different kinds of creatures, elves and humans and cyclops. And this is the world that he created his story about. This is a 5th grader's world that she created. This is from Ryan Scala's classroom on Long Island. Here's a fairy tale world that a child created. And then here's a wizarding world that a child created. Ruthie created here in Brooklyn. She wrote a wizarding world story, but she created part of London and figured out where her wizard world was. And then she actually created a map of the school. And one more, here's a science fiction world. that a student from Tim Saunders' class created in Michigan. So we imagine this whole solar system and all the planets and who lives on them. Because science fiction, by the way, is a kind of fantasy. Technically, it's called scientific fantasy. So this is every child that's in a fantasy study in the upper grades creates a world like this. And so they get world building experience. They create their own paracosms. So they all get some experience with this very creative act. And young children, going to K&1, the young children create their worlds, and Matt, this is something you talk a lot about, the compositional, the way that young children compose text. And when young children compose text, they are both creating the story that they're telling at the same time that they're writing it. Here's a first grader's story called the Red Dragon's Castle. And, as Emmeline wrote this story, she created the world simultaneously as she was writing this story. But just look at the illustrations to see the absolute complexity of the world that the 6-year-old created here. So this is a really fascinating world because in Emmeline's world, dragons control the castle. So she flips everything upside down. So, once upon a time, there was a castle and there was a red dragon guarding it. Roar, roar, roar went the powerful dragon. And here's the dragon. So she created an image in her mind of the dragon. And in the castle, there lived purple dragons. There were little dragons and big dragons. And look at the intricacy of the world she's creating within the castle. There's not only a dragon outside the castle, but she's imagined every room in the castle that's now currently populated by a dragon. And what happens in the rest of the story? I mean, she creates this world, this scenario where what if dragons had taken over the kingdom? What would you do? And so the story that she tells is about a little girl named Sarah who goes and confronts the dragon, and they have a fight, and Sarah was able to defeat the dragon and I guess right the world and bring it back to where it should be. But anyway, I just think the world building that even here's a 6-year-old gets a chance to do is just so stunning. And so, writing fantasy is so highly creative. I do think that's another reason why kids like it. Kids are attracted to creative things that involve a lot of play. And fantasy gives kids a chance to tap into that part of themselves. And make a contribution to, developing kids' creative skills, which, are, Tony Wagner, who's written the 21st century, the survival skill, 21st century survival skills. He talks about creativity as such an important skill for kids who are growing up now in the world that they're going to be going into, both to solve serious problems and to be successful at work and, civically. But these creativity skills are so important, Matt. So, I think this world building part is absolutely fascinating, creating worlds and characters that populated them. And kids have so much fun doing it, and their brains just get really stretched.
Well, and I was thinking about what you said a minute ago about what some of the reasons that fantasy sometimes isn't taught as much in schools. And you mentioned test scores. But what strikes me, or not test scores, but the nature of standardized tests. But what strikes me is that so many of the skills that you're talking about here both impact children's intellectual development, and they impact the type of creative problem solving and the type of intellectual dispositions that students need to develop. And it also strikes me, though, that this type of writing in this way really accelerates or has the potential to accelerate student growth in writing. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, because it's undeniable, certainly just from a student engagement standpoint. But I also think this type of writing helps students become substantially better writers.
Yeah. And, what's so interesting, Matt, I mean, I've done, when I started this project, it was, as I was referring to, I was teaching a class of children in China through Zoom. And I had about 10 kids that I worked with every Saturday for a year. And the work was mind-blowing to me. It was by far the most engaging writing we did together. It was by far the most writing that I saw from kids. And by far, it was the unit in which the lessons that I taught the kids used most successfully because they were so engaged in the writing they were doing. And that's something I've just seen again and again and again in classrooms. In Emmeline's classroom, whose writing is still up on the screen, she's a student at PS10 in here in Brooklyn, about 5 blocks from my house. Um, it was just so remarkable that, her teacher just said over and over again, and we did that. I was there in January, February of first grade, and she said she had not seen the volume of writing that kids were doing was far surpassing anything they had done so far that year. They just were having so much fun and they were so engaged in the writing they were doing. It was both the length of the stories and the number of stories the kids wrote during the study. And the same thing in the upper grades, Matt, just the amount of writing kids do and their willingness to take on the lessons, the craft lessons, the process lessons that we teach in these units is just, I just think it's remarkable to see how seriously kids takes those lessons because they are so motivated to really make their story as fantastic as they can make it because they're so highly engaged in it. So, we all want kids to meet standards and to grow as writers. I think when we take this stance that we're going to incorporate high engagement units into a child's year, like fantasy, just kids write more and they try the lessons that we teach with the seriousness that I don't see as much when the units aren't as engaging.
Yeah, so I think you're making a great case for why teaching fantasy is so crucial. What's interesting is I think for a lot of teachers, it's a little daunting sometimes to teach it. I know for myself, it's I feel much more comfortable writing true stories, things that have happened to me, than fantasy. And so because it's more challenging for me to write. I think it's sometimes teachers will shy away from it. But that's what I think is so important about this book is, after, reading it and thinking this, I think, oh, I could teach fantasy so much better than I could before. And so I'm wondering if you might just talk through some of the supports that you have here for helping teachers become comfortable feeling or, be comfortable teaching this. I'm just wondering about some of the teaching moves that you're thinking about for when you're teaching fantasy, things that'll help teachers, make this type of teaching both easier and more effective.
Yeah, so let me get into some of the guts of what this book does, Matt. Let me just skim ahead to chapter 4 of the book. Okay, that's actually chapter 5. So, Matt, we talk a lot about units of study and projecting units and creating units and some of the moves that are important to make when we do that work, when we design curriculum. And so the book actually contains 3 units, one for kindergarten first graders, one for second and third graders, and one for 4th through 6th graders. But each of the unit has certain components that I just think are fundamental to doing a unit of study that each unit walks you through. So I'm just going to do a quick tour of one of the units. I'll walk through the one for grades 2 and 3 that I call Magical Relationships. And by the way, my oldest child, Ansia, illustrated this book, just so you all know. I'm so thrilled to have her art in this book. So some of the key moves. I mean, part of what I do in the book, Matt, is talk about how to get ready for a fantasy unit. Okay, and let's see if I can. So early in each unit, there's a part I'm preparing, and there's a bunch of steps, but one of the steps is to teach the craft of fantasy writing, you need good mentor text, and so that's part of each unit in this book. And for the K1 and 2, 3 units, all the mentor texts are picture books, and the kids write fantasy picture books in those grades, and so I have a lot of suggestions. I detail just fantastic fantasy picture books that are easy to find for those grade level bands. And then for the upper grades in 4, 5, 6 in that unit, I switched to illustrated stories from like Highlights Magazine or Cricket Magazine. The book actually comes with 10 downloadable stories for upper grade teachers. I wish it came with downloadable picture books, but the price of including Maurice Sendak's Where the Wild Things Are is quite prohibitive. So we couldn't do that. But all the mentor texts for the lower grades are easily obtainable, and the ones for upper grades are there. So that's part of it. I mean, I provide it, but I also talk about the criteria for finding other ones as well, and creating a stack of good, good mentor texts. This is actually the chart of some suggested mentor texts for grades 2 and 3. So that's one move that I talk about in each unit. The second, and I think this is maybe a little daunting to people to think about, but I think a really important one. And one thing you and I both believe in is that we think it's important that people teaching a unit try their hand at the kind of writing to write what we call a process text. And because that gives you a chance to work through the writing process, see what strategies you use, and then you can use your own writing to teach how to navigate the writing process. And so in each of the units, I model that with my own writing. In the grade 2-3 unit, I wrote this story called Eric and the Ogre, about a boy who's being bullied at a summer camp and goes into the forest, meets an ogre who coaches him a little bit, and things turn out okay for him in the end. And one thing you notice there's some revisions on there. Okay, and so there is a revision lesson in the unit where I use this text to show kids how I revised this particular story. So, but I think that's important to create your own process text, whether you teach kindergarten, 3rd grade, or 6th grade, or 7th or 8th grade for that matter. And so I model that in each unit. And then I get to the guts of the unit. Okay, that's preparation work. There's other stuff in here, but let's get to the actual unit. And I do have a unit overview guide. One of the things that I walk people through, Matt, and something you and I both love, is the immersion state of a unit of study, the immersion stage. And that's something that would start any unit, where you're going to spend a couple of days reading your mentor text with the students. So I detail that in each unit, what that would look like. And then once immersion happens, then we're off and running with writing. The actual writing of fantasy stories. So, what I offer in the book are lessons, process lessons, and craft lessons for each unit. I have a projected order of those units, but I didn't write this with you must do this with fidelity. I don't believe in that. I projected it, but also talk about how you might revise the unit to make it better fit the needs of your children. But I do include a lot of, I think for this particular unit, there are 17 craft and process lessons. There are actually other lessons online that you could swap in for some of these lessons, so there's actually some like 25 lessons for this unit. Some you would do in conferences and small groups if you don't have time to do it in a mini lesson. And I'll just show you what some of those look like. Like this is a process lesson here for grades 2-3. It's called Create the Main Character for Your Story. And I model it with my writing. Have some student examples of what that looks like. This is Dane's, a 3rd grader. Excuse me. It's the character she created after I taught this lesson in her classroom. So they're process lessons. This is a world building lesson, obviously. That creating a secondary character. These are secondary characters that Dane created. Creating a setting. There's my setting for my story right there. And there's Dane's map of her world. So I have process lessons like that. And then I have a lot of craft lessons too, Matt. Like, for example, how to introduce the main character's problem or challenge early in the story. So, once the kids are writing, they need a mixture of process lessons, like world building lessons, a lot of craft lessons, like how to begin, different kinds of details, how to write magic, how to transition from scene to scene, how to resolve your character's issue in the ending. And so I walk people through that with a series of suggested lessons. That's what, those are the key moves. And so just to kind of reiterate that, it's just to prepare for it, gathering mentor text and writing your own process text. I talk about those. And then the outline of the unit, the immersion, and then the series of craft and process lessons. I walk through those people and give people lots of ideas of possible lessons they could teach in each of these units. Okay, great fun to do this stuff in classrooms and then to write about it. And you can see that almost every one of these lessons contains student examples. This one's from Emily Callahan's class, one of her students. So there's a lot of my writing mentor text and a lot of student examples of what they did with the work to help folks imagine what their own students might do.
And as you think through all that, Carl, what I'm wondering about some of the differences in how you're thinking about this and what you've learned about this with young students versus older students. Certainly, so many of those teaching moves are the same type of move, but of course things play out a little differently with younger children than older children. So,
Right.
around how that's different. What have you learned about that from younger and older children?
Actually, no, it was actually really kind of daunting to write a book that goes from kindergarten through sixth grade, and to think about what approach would you take with fantasy writing with kindergarten first graders, and what approach would you take with fourth, fifth, and sixth graders. And so, it's interesting, Matt, that I coached baseball for many years. And, the way that my little league does baseball is that, 5-year-olds don't play baseball like adults do. They play t-ball, they hit off a stick. And then by the time they're 16, they're finally playing the game as, the bases are the same distance apart. They pitch hard, and it's the same game that adults play in the major leagues. But we create a game for younger children that is more appropriate for them and gradually bring them closer and closer to the actual game. And in a way, that's what I've done in this book, Matt. I had to think, what would my goals be for someone that's 5 or 6 years old? What would my goals be for, for second and third graders? What would my goals be for older kids? Getting closer and closer to the work that adult writers do. So for primary kids, the unit for kindergarten and first graders is a unit I call Introduction to Fantasy Writing. And basically what this unit does is it introduces kids to 5, 6, or 7 different kinds of fantasy. Like, portal stories, science fiction stories, what I call magical relationship stories, like Where the Wild Things Are, where a character meets other, in this case, magical creatures, wizard stories. And in this unit, it's really a unit that's designed to give kids a sense of the different subgenres of fantasy and to try their hand at it. And so kids write a wide range of different kinds of fantasy stories. I think, again, going back to engagement, because there's so many choices of genres, subgenres, the kids all find 1 or 2 they really love and try those out and try other ones too. So I see the first unit is a chance just to explore the different kinds of fantasy. Younger children write books, picture books, because that's what they read, and that's a difference between that and the very upper grades. And as I said before, the world building happens more as the kids compose. I don't have the kids draw worlds and characters before they write their stories. I do teach them to think about, if you're writing this kind of story, like if you're writing a fairy tale story, it's probably going to take place in an area where there's a castle and there's going to be certain kinds of characters, royalty, and creatures like dragons. So when you start, I do teach kids to think about what the components of the genre would be. If you're writing science fiction, it's either going to be an alien probably comes to Earth, like My Alien, wonderful mentor text, or you go out into the universe and have an experience. So that's the world building kids do there. But they do that as they compose. The grade 2 or 3 unit gets a little more complex. The same goal is from the primary units there, but I add some things on, just like baseball gets more complex in my little league as the kids get older. Let me just pop up the first page of that. So the grades 2, 3, and it's called Magical Relationships. The kids still get a choice of genre. There's still 4, 5, 6 subgenres of fantasy that are introduced in the mentor text. Kids are again writing picture books in grades 2 and 3. The best mentor text I find for this grade level are picture books. But what I add into it here is some early world building work, where kids, before they start writing stories, do the work. We saw a little bit of this as I went through this before, but they do a little bit of work creating characters and settings before they start. Okay, I'm just trying to find some of this. I don't think I'm going to be able to. No, I'm way, way deep into this unit here. Let's see. Yeah, so like the early lessons, create a character for your story. Decide what kind of problem your character has. This next lesson is, create a secondary character. and then create a setting. So there is some world building in the grades 2 or 3 unit, but the world building gets more complex in the upper grade unit. But so I introduced some world building work, and then the kids start writing stories incorporating what they've created in their characters and the settings. And then the upper grade unit, and again, just like when in my baseball league, 16 and 17-year-olds play the same rules, the same size field as Major League Baseball players. I teach kids all the stuff that adult fantasy writers do in this unit. This unit's called Magical Worlds. And in this unit, the kids do the same kind of world building that experienced fantasy writers do, like N.K. Jemisin. So, the first units are creating a fantasy world, and that's beginnings of my world right there. And you've already seen this, but kids start to create worlds. They then, that's another world that these are different worlds kids created. Kids then populate their worlds. Okay, and this is the exact work that adult fantasy writers do. There's my process text, and there's Alyssa's first stab at Budulin. And then the kids do things with their worlds, like they create magic systems for their world. They create the politics of their world. They decide how everyone gets along. And then they create characters. Okay, create a main character, and they create a secondary character. So the amount of world building increases in the upper grades. Okay, and the complexity of what kids doing, it grows. And then the other difference in the upper grades would be they still get a chance to explore different subgenres. They're still creating characters, and of course they are creating a much more extensive world in the upper grades. But I am shifting in the upper grades towards kids writing illustrated stories, the kind of stories, fantasy stories you find in Cricket magazine or Highlights magazine. And as I said, I was fortunate enough to be able to get permission from Highlights and Crickets to include some of those stories as downloadables, because it's pretty easy to find picture books for the units in the lower grades, but much harder to find text in magazines from 15 years ago. So I include a whole bunch of them as downloadables for the upper grade units. So I think, Matt, to answer your question, succinctly, I think that baseball metaphor and the sports metaphor of how we increase complexity of a sport as kids get older is really what I've tried to do here with this book, is to create units that provide different grade level challenges for kids depending on where they are. And it's really fun to see how that kind of builds across time. It's not, the upper grade unit does not depend upon kids having done the lower grade units. It certainly helps if kids have studied it before and you're doing it in 5th grade. But when I've done this in most classrooms in 4th, 5th, and 6th grade, kids have never written fantasy before, and they do fantastic work.
So, Carl, if we think about making the case for fantasy and all these supports for making it easier to teach fantasy, what are some of the things that you think teachers need to watch out for, some obstacles that they may encounter in terms of including fantasy in their year in writing curriculums, and how do you overcome those obstacles?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, Matt. Because let me take a couple of them on. One thing to know about fantasy writing is that historically there's been a real bias against fantasy writing in the academy. Let's go back to Shakespeare. Let's go back 500 years. And this is something a lot of you probably don't know, but he was really criticized for the fantasy elements in his writing. Some of the critics at the time said it was evidence of his common roots. So, and even when I studied Shakespeare in high school and college, we rarely focused on the fantastical elements. There were witches in Macbeth. We didn't talk about them that much. There were fairies in Midsummer Night's Dream. We didn't talk about them that much. We talked about theme and plot and character. But even Shakespeare was criticized for it. And fantasy writer after fantasy, like Brandon Sanderson will say that when he applied to some of the famous writing programs in the country and sent some of his fantasy work to people said, we don't do that here. We do realistic fiction. That's the highest level of writing. We do memoir. That's the highest level of writing. So there's been this historic bias against fantasy writing. And I think that does show up in curriculums for children. The bias that you and I have seen for decades has been in favor of kids writing true stories. And it's not uncommon to be in a school and to see that kids write personal narrative every single year. And personal narrative has been raised as the most important and valuable narrative genre. And I just disagree. I'm not against personal narrative or memoir. I love teaching those things. I just don't think kids should do it every year. And I think kids should get a chance to explore high engagement narrative units like fantasy also. But there has been this bias, which I got as in my PD as a teacher too. It was a clear bias for true stories versus fantasy stories. So I think that's one obstacle right there, is this curricular bias that's in writing curriculums that you and I see all the time, towards personal narrative. And I just had experience in a school. It's kind of sad experience, where a school that I'm been working with was really excited about the fantasy work, and they were going to do it this fall. But then they were told, the teachers that were going to do it said, no, you must do personal narrative in the fall, as if it were some law. Like, you have to do this. And I'm working with plenty of teachers now that one of their first units, their first narrative unit genre study is fantasy. And what a great way to start the year. It's so high engagement. It's like, it's like you create an engagement high early in the year, and that you can coast on that momentum for quite a while after that. Different than, yes, we're doing personal narrative for the 6th time in early 5th grade. I've done it every year. So I do think, Matt, that's one thing that gets in the way of it. And keep in mind, this is, we were in Maine the last couple of days.
Just real quick before you go to the next, what's interesting always about that, of course, is most people's standards don't say anything about personal narrative writing. They talk about narrative, right? People have narrative writing standards, but unfortunately, most standards allow schools and districts to decide what genre of narrative writing. Everything that shows up in the standards around narrative writing, you can teach with fantasy just as easily as you could with personal narrative, and increase student engagement at the same time. Sorry, go ahead.
Right. You and I were together in Maine the last couple of days, and yesterday when I was with the teachers that I was working with, we actually read the narrative standards, or maybe it was Tuesday we did that. Maine says the narrative standard is kids will write real or imagined stories. Okay, they're not saying that kids should write true stories. They're just saying kids should write narratives, and they can be realistic fiction, historical fiction, fantasy fiction, or all imagined stories. New York has the same standard here. We have the same standard that kids will write real or imagined stories. So kudos to Maine, kudos to New York for being supportive of kids writing imaginary stories. Fantasy being one of those genres of imaginary stories. And I think what's interesting in when I projected the units for the fantasy book, as you were just saying, a lot of the lessons you could teach just as easily in personal narrative. They're not teaching kids to use dialogue, thinking, and action, teaching kids to start a story with the character's problem, teaching kids that you go on an emotional journey with the character and reveal the character's thinking and the change in their thinking across the story. That's not fantasy. That's just good storytelling. And people who write fantasy do that. People that write realistic fiction do that. A good memoir, you see that. You can teach the same lessons in fantasy that you would teach in a personal narrative unit. The difference being you get so much engagement in fantasy, and kids want to learn those lessons in a very different way than if they're writing personal narrative because we do that at the beginning of every year, and we just have to do this. The bias against fantasy, I think, is there. And I think another thing that I'm seeing right now, Matt, is just the hardening of curriculum. It's like, well, we've done it this way for years. We're just going to keep doing it this way. We've always started this way, and we're not going to change it. And that's sometimes a message from supervisors. And sometimes it's hard to think that, oh, I could do this differently than I've done it for a bunch of years. And it feels a little risky to put fantasy in the beginning of the school year or the middle of the school year instead of waiting to the end where we may not even have any time for it. Because goodness, what could happen in a school year that might disrupt things, right? But I think those are different things that get in the way of fantasy writing, Matt.
Well, just your enthusiasm for this comes through so clearly, and how passionate you are about this. And I know that so much of that comes from what you've seen happen to students, the shifts that you've seen in children's dispositions towards writing, simply by having the opportunity to do this, regardless of how effective the teaching is and everything else. It just strikes me how powerful this is just by tapping into things that children are already dying to do, interested in doing. So,
Right.
there's
to some extent, Matt, I think my book is an apology book. I taught writing for about a decade myself as a writing teacher in the Bronx and rural Kentucky and Louisville and suburban Illinois. And, my message to my kids was true stories. I internalized this and I said, you're going to write true stories. And occasionally a kid would write a fantasy story if it was a unit in which they had choice of genre. And I saw some amazing stuff the kids did, but it's like, all right, so you did that, but I just still was valuing the personal narratives most, and I wasn't valuing the fantasy writing the kids are doing on the same level. And I just wish, looking back, that I had not said to my kids, no aliens in your stories. I think I would have had higher engagement from a lot of kids if they could have done more of this kind of work. And so, part of the trajectory of what I'm doing is to learn from children. This was a lesson that took me a long time to learn, just the value of this. But my kids were telling me that from the beginning. I had a boy, my first year of writing workshop, a little boy named Tunde. I was teaching in the Bronx in New York City, and he wrote a story where he was a superhero, and he had the power to bring. There was a lot of racial tension in New York City that year, some of the things that were happening. And in his story, as a superhero, he was able to bring people together. He had the superpower to bring people that didn't trust each other together. And, and what a powerful thing. And I just wish I had learned earlier that fantasy gave kids tools to do amazing work, to think about amazing things, to process the death of a family member, to imagine a city where people can get along better than they were getting along in 1988 in New York City. Just amazing stuff that kids were telling. They were teaching me things that I wasn't hearing. And but I've heard when I did the course, when I worked with the kids from Shenzhen, I had a couple weeks left in the course, and they said, I'll try fantasy writing. Why not? And that all of a sudden things shifted so radically. And it was like, okay, this is so powerful. I need to write about this. I need to share this. I need to do this in more classrooms and share the work. And so I've worked in public schools all over the country, either in schools or in through Zoom or private schools. And the book is the result of learning from kids the power of this and what it can do for them. The expressive possibilities that are important for them at their ages.
Yeah, I'm so glad this support's out there, because I know it's easy for your teachers to think about the importance of this, but even more so needing that type of support that this book provides. So I'm just so glad that this is now out in the world.
Yeah. And one thing I'll say, I know that we have some people live here and some people will be coming on later, but let me just put my email up. If I can just find a slide that has it. Let's see. Because I'm very interested in what people do with this in their classroom. So if you are someone this year that is taking this on in your classroom, like let's say you get a copy of my book and you take this on, or you get a couple colleagues, you want to try this unit together, let me know. Let me just put my email up here. Just going to write it down here. Let me know, because I would love to talk to you about how it's going, see some of the work that your students do. So just reach out to me and let me know that you're doing it, whatever questions you have. And I would love to hear about some of your experiences doing this. I promise you we'll have an exciting conversation and you'll be marveling with the work that your students do on many levels. But I would really like to hear what people are doing with this. So please reach out to me about it.
Yeah, I hope people will.
Yeah, I hope so too.
I know. Thank you, Carl and Matt. That was wonderful. A lot. It's kind of resonated with me and my kind of writing and my love for fantasy, reading as well. I wish you all the best, Carl, and thank you all for being here. And to all those people who will be watching this online, this will be available on our YouTube channel, our Chapters International, and I look forward to seeing you all again. Thank you again. Thank you, everyone.